to think through the images that we have in our collection of the Prophet Muhammad and what we can do with those as institution, whether or not it isn't too politically correct not to show those images. For whom or which citizen is it okay to offend and which not? Because if we think that it is politically correct to do that to show these images, to not show these images, then it behooves us to think what other images we would not show or show for differently constituted subjects. And the question is, as curators, as museums, as institutions, what do we allow? Which one of these voices do we allow? If those are citizens as well, which one of these epistemes, as Ronaldo said, comes out and which one goes back into the shadows?
A set of questions I would like to raise about collaborative practices of museums of ethnography or world cultures with so-called source communities and diaspora groups in their immediate surroundings. Such formats are thought to be geared to enable encounters, not only with objects, but between people, and to give voice to other perspectives on museum holdings and narratives. Equally, collaborative contemporary art projects also, which sometimes take place at these museums, have adopted comparative approaches by getting deeply immersed in other cultural spheres of knowledge and living in co-creating collaborative artscapes with members of these communities.
Now, when we use the term citizenship, the concept citizenship, inevitably, without our volition or will, or even intentionality, we invoke a paradox. This paradox is partly because citizenship has a particular history as a strategy of government that divides. It's a biopolitical technology that divides people into groups, insiders, outsiders, creates new forms of inclusions, exclusions, and it creates notions of us and them. For citizenship to be able to function, it needs to create these divisions through which it works. My primary focus will be performative citizenship, which I consider a critical way of approaching citizenship. Now, I consider a performative citizenship in this critical sense to include 5 senses of citizenship. It is about signifying citizenship. So we are not necessarily describing citizenship as it exists, but we are signifying or perhaps even re-signifying citizenship. How we re-signify it, we bring various senses to it.
I have been thinking and making work about and writing about ideas of citizenship and belonging for a very long time. Europe the Game was made in the early 2000s. I can't tell you exactly when because it was, because I can't remember. But it took a number of years to do it, and it was made in specifically in reference to the concepts that were around at the time called about Fortress Europe, where Europe was imagining itself or building borders, imaginary or actual, between Europe and other. I wanted to push the idea that paintings or any object is actually relational, and really pushing it by making it a game. So that is also an objective in this particular artwork, is to push beyond simply understanding commodities, artworks as commodities or objects that are mute. So we're going to play the game. The whole idea is that everybody here is making a choice, a decision. So there's 2 boxes here, 1 box there. This is the frame.
Ja, misschien.
Property. I would like to encourage you to stand around and defend your choice. If somebody starts taking out what you think belongs in.
It's too much, but all of it is green. It's just too much green. It's too much green. And there's still a bit of English.
You can move others to get access if you want, or you can just throw however.
She said that they all come from Europe.
They are all Europe.
Yeah, but for me,
It's up to you. This is representations. What of these represent Europe? It was a conscious choice to do so-called nature and not so-called culture. These are cultural representations of nature and what is natural. The reason why, in particular, I wanted to bring it to this conference is because it brings up another very important concept, which is curation.
The question is actually like what's, like how can ethnographic museums, how should they react to certain politics of exclusion and inclusion that are happening in current times? I would like to provide like a glimpse into how we at the World Museum Vienna dealt with this very difficult question. We also have one exhibition space that is called World on the Move, dedicated to topics such as migration and globalization, where we like discussed actually a lot about this question. So I'll provide a glimpse into how like we thought up like certain strategies that we could implement. So our basic stance, first of all, is that migration and globalization isn't just a recent phenomenon that is just happening since the 21st century, but that it is an integral part of humanity.
In the previous presentations, we've seen that museums are places where the nation can be imagined and narrated, or the European continent, or national identity. And I'm interested in how refugee stories might enter this canon, national canon. I think the refugee crisis is not only the story of the other, it is also a story about ourselves, and we are implicated in this crisis. And so my question is it the refugee that needs to be experienced? Or is it us? Maybe we should perform ourselves. If we're talking about inclusiveness, I think both positions should be performed.
In this talk, I'll use several recent events in Canada's two largest museums, the Canadian Museum of History and the Royal Ontario Museum, to explore the virtues both of fast change, quickly developed programs that can respond to a crisis, and of the slow change characteristic of major museum projects. Fierce national controversies, which erupted around two large exhibitions of the late 1980s, the Glenbow Museum's The Spirit Sings, Artistic Traditions of Canada's First Peoples, and the Royal Ontario Museum's Into the Heart of Africa, led to the 1992 report of the Task Force on Museums and First Peoples. Its recommended models of community collaboration and partnership have been broadly adopted since. Ethnographic museums have been in the vanguard, but multi-perspectivalism and partnership have also been picked up by museums of history, art, and natural history. By the beginning of the new millennium, these models seemed securely established, and it was thus all the more shocking to witness the shutting down of many decolonizing and democratizing initiatives under the Harper conservative government. The changes, unprecedented in scope and degree, were imposed through budgetary cutbacks, restructurings, appointments to boards of trustees, and tighter ministerial scrutiny. On November 9th, ROM's director and senior administrators issued a formal apology to Canadians of African descent for the injury caused by the controversial 1989 exhibition mentioned earlier, Into the Heart of Africa. The museum acknowledged that the exhibition had, quote, unintentionally reproduced the colonial, racist, and Eurocentric premises through which its African collections had been acquired, and thus contributed to anti-African racism, unquote. My point is simply that the 27 years and several changes of administration that passed before the ROM delivered the apology demanded by the protesters have largely stymied projects designed to work constructively with Toronto's African Canadian communities and posed a barrier to the museum's ability to foster a sense of belonging and shared citizenship. Slow change can be good, but it can also be too slow.
Like many other places, Israel too is experiencing a flow of new museums and memorials. And I believe that the role of museums in the nation-building process can't be considered separately from that of memorials. To answer questions such as whose heritage and whose memory is it anyway, we need to take into account processes of creating and reinforcing a national narrative and collective memory as is done by the Israeli government. The complex Israeli national narrative is largely the Zionist story. The collective memory consequently deals largely with the devotion and sacrifices this involved. And starting even before the establishment of the state in 1948, every new museum has had to deal with the question of whether to relate to the Zionist narrative or to another narrative. The answer depends on the political position or aspirations of the museum founders. It seems that ethnographic and migration museums haven't changed their policies, choosing instead to continue to promote distortions of their own narratives that they hope will be accepted as part of the national narrative. So the question of what role ethnographic museums can play in fashioning a more convivial policies seems at present not relevant for Israel. Rather, the question that should be asked is whether belonging remains a goal worth striving for.
And one of the things that I've been learning as a migrant in Stuttgart who doesn't speak German is that the language is very important as a feature of identity for Stuttgarters or for Schwäbisch people in Stuttgart, which is an internal ethnic minority, who has, the symbolic belonging to Baden-Württemberg. And in the process of learning German, we're also learning what it means to be a good German. You know how it works.
A lot of migrants were passing Slovenia, and that there were very difficult situations on the border between Slovenia and Croatia. And so our colleagues from the museum went there, helping refugees and also making field work, collecting wire from the border, tents and other material things of the refugees. This is one thing. And on the other side, we are preparing an exhibition of encounters between Slovenes and Afghani, which were very, very vivid exactly in the 70s and 80s of the 19th century.
I don't know if you saw La Grande Bellezza by Sorrentino. At one point, it struck me because I've always been subjected to culture shock. This nun, at one point, she asked the protagonist, "Do you know why I only eat roots?" And she said, "Because we need them."
We are dealing very, very much with Slovene national identity, because the Slovene nation is only 2 million nation, and it is living within independent state till 1991.
I think museums in Euro-America have a very have a global sort of language, but their articulation is very local.
It's also, an experiment maybe of changing the curatorial approach, because, I cannot just be Sandra the migrant. I have to be also a curator, and it's we contract everything.